There are a lot of stories and urban legends about Chuck E. Cheese animatronics, such as they look at the cameras and they move around at night. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's all horseshit. Animatronics are shut off after hours and bolted to the floor at all times. However, there is one slight exception to this. I am the assistant manager at a local Chuck E. Cheese that has been around since it was a showbiz pizza back when I was a kid. Until I grew out of the Chuck E. Cheese goer age, I always aspired to work there, to get close to the animatronics and see what made them tick. I knew kids who were frightened to death by them, but they were my favorite thing since I first saw them. Then I forgot about it. I never went back to the place since my friend's birthday party when he and I were about 6, up until a few months ago. At first, I didn't know what Chuck E. Cheese was when I saw their hiring sign, but the address looked familiar. I looked it up, and considering my options in this small, nothing town I live in, I convinced myself to go in and grab the job. To make a long story short, I got the job. I started working as a janitor, but someone replaced me. Instead of firing me, though, they bumped me up to assistant manager and hired another manager. Supposedly, the business had been scraping along without one because they couldn't afford to hire one, even though it was demanded by the company that they need an assistant manager. But, anywho, I'm getting a little off track. In the restaurant, there's a back room where the animatronics were stored before they were repurposed as the new Chuck E. Cheese type animatronics. Mainly, they took the endoskeletons and guts from the old ones and stuffed them into new costumes. However, there was an extra animatronic left over from showbiz that didn't fit with the new lineup of animatronics. It was a clown with rainbow hair, a big red nose, a yellow costume, you know, the works. It didn't actually have any legs, so it was stuck in a painted wooden booth. I remember it from showbiz when it used to greet customers. Anyway, back to me. I was called for a meeting with all the other employees by the manager to help brainstorm on ways to make more money. After all, 2 extra employees can't pay for themselves. One person suggested we add tunnels for the kids to play in, but it would cramp up the already tiny building too much. Another suggested extra arcade machines, but they didn't gross enough to be worthwhile unless there was more business and the building was bigger. After sitting, melting into our chairs in the stuffy, poorly ventilated meeting room for about 15 minutes, which felt like an hour and a half, the manager suddenly sat up with what appeared to be an idea. "I've got it," he said. "We should use Creepy in the back." That's what we called the old clown animatronic in the back. I mean, he was really disturbing. We should use Creepy in the back for educational purposes. Think about it. We strip the costume off to just the endoskeleton and add signs and pamphlets about how it works. The parents would go apeshit for that sort of thing, no? Everyone, myself included, nodded in agreement and murmured a "yeah" or an "okay," desperate to escape from the hellhole of a meeting room. Fast forward to a week later and we've got it all set up, right in a corner to the left of the entrance. The upper half of the endoskeleton, sitting in a wooden box, which has been repainted with something like, "Learn how we work," with the Chuck E. Cheese mascots painted below it. Several colorful signs have been placed around and inside the animatronic, which describe its parts and what they do in simple, kid-friendly terms. As we had hoped, parents went nuts for the attraction. Holding their children's shoulders tight, who just wanted to play with the arcade games and devour the wretched pizza. Guiding them over to the booth, oohing and eyeing, trying to coax their children into being interested in the endoskeleton. There were a few straggler kids who went up to the booth by themselves, occasionally in a group, but it was mostly to kick and stick gum to the clear plastic shell we had placed over the stripped animatronic. It was truly a sight to behold. Wires, frames, and tubes exposed. Eyeballs with small white irises staring at the animatronic stage. Motionless. Unlike most cliché stories about these sorts of events, I did not get a bad feeling about the animatronic skeleton, nor did it stare at me. It just looked off into space, completely motionless. The day we finished the informational booth went well. As I mentioned, the thing was a hit. However, I'm not here to endlessly describe how business was, or glorify the animatronic skeleton. That evening, everyone left, the manager and I being the last. Walking out, we blabbed about our social lives, shooting the bull, and he jammed his key in, locking the door. As we bid each other farewell for the weekend. It was a Friday, his nephew was covering my weekend shift, and besides, this town is pretty old-fashioned. Most places are still closed on Sundays. But I caught a glimpse inside the dark building through a window, and I swore that I saw the animatronic skeleton twitch for a moment. Shunning the thought of a disabled animatronic moving when it was unplugged, I got in my car and went home. The weekend passed, which consisted of me visiting my mother and logging more hours into games on my PC. Returning to work on Monday, a few minutes past on time, I walked in and looked around. Everything was where it should be. Grimy arcade machines in place, greasy quarter dispenser still somewhat functional. It was all good. Looking over into the corner where the endoskeleton booth was, I noticed something different about it. The animatronic was looking in a different direction. Straight down, rather than at the stage. I quickly realized that the manager's nephew had most likely been messing with it, but I then remembered it was bolted down. Both the shell to the booth, and the booth, well, to the floor. The manager walked out and greeted me, and being the coolest manager ever, he didn't mention how I was 10 minutes late. The thing he did mention, however, was that the animatronic skeleton's head was in a different direction. His theory was that the neck was getting too weak and worn out to support the head, which seemed pretty plausible. I provided him with the question of what would happen if we plugged it in, and he said it would be a waste of power, so I forgot about it. The day went normally. I watched over the employees and even had a slice of the aforementioned terrible pizza. The next day went fine, and the next. However, about a week or two later, give or take a few days, strange things revolving around the animatronic skeleton were happening. I was reviewing a night's security footage as usual, and even in the low frame rate used to save storage space, I saw the animatronic blink slowly and deliberately. A few days later, reviewing the overnight footage again, I noticed the animatronic slowly raise its head back to face the stage, but then move back to its prior position. The following days after these strange incidents led to an investigation by my manager, my fellow employees, and myself. We had singled out almost everyone except the janitor, the manager, and me. Once again, sitting in the stuffy meeting room, everyone talked amongst themselves until the manager cleared his throat. Silence befell the room as everyone stared at the manager, or down at their feet. He eventually spoke up. After much thought, we have come to the conclusion that someone is playing an elaborate prank. This is strictly against company policy, and as such I cannot allow whoever is behind it to remain employed. As much as I don't want to do this, I'm afraid we'll have to let you go. He turned to one of the janitors who was, as I was informed, working overtime when the incidents occurred. Jeremy? Well, we'll call him Jeremy. He turned to the janitor, who was sweating profusely. Then again, we were all sweating profusely, but that's not the point. He became flustered, swallowing frantically, trying to reason with the manager. I'm sorry, Jeremy, but all the evidence points to you, and I cannot allow this to continue. The janitor bared his teeth in anger, ripping at his shirt, and stormed out of the room. Everyone watched in shock as he pushed down cardboard cutouts and kicked an arcade machine on his way. Speechless, the manager waved us out, and we continued our duties. The day soon ended as usual, and we went home. The next day came, and I surveyed the security tapes, finding nothing unusual. At this point, I was convinced it was Jeremy finding some way to mess with the animatronic. It seemed that, at a certain point, my life had become almost nothing more than checking security tapes, hoping, yet also hoping against, for the animatronic skeleton to move, to do something. But, for over 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, of course, something did. Otherwise, why would I be talking about it? It happened on Monday night. Police tape covered the door and a broken window. My jaw dropped as police stood outside the building shooting the bull and writing things, not allowing me to enter. A few hours later, I got inside and reviewed the security footage. The first few minutes were fine, but then I noticed in the corner of the frame something appeared on the floor. I quickly realized that it was glass, and a few moments later, I witnessed a man in a black balaclava and hoodie crawl through the window holding a drill. Even though he obviously meant to conceal his identity, it was pretty obvious that the perpetrator was Jeremy, the employee who had just been fired. I could tell by his build and the way he walked. Holding what appeared to be an impact driver, he unbolted the animatronic booth from the floor and lifted it above his head. At this point, I was just as much impressed as I was shocked. That thing weighed at least 150 to maybe 200 pounds. And considering his build, which was tall and skinny, this was no small feat. He staggered over to the main animatronic stage and smashed the booth into it. The chef animatronic had received serious damage to its left foot, which was near where he smashed the booth into. The animatronic inside the booth had shockingly survived without a scratch. The booth, however, was completely ruined. Shortly thereafter, the cops caught him, and, not surprisingly, it was Jeremy. We closed for a few days for repairs, made a new booth, and were right back on track. The following few weeks after went like they were supposed to. One employee quit and another was hired. Things were going well. But of course, like before, things started derailing again. It started with the animatronic now changing entire positions. The camera feeds became increasingly jumpy and shoddy, which, for reasons unknown, made my heart sink. I should have quit there, just up and left. Others did. Most did, in fact. The manager did everything he could to conceal the happenings from the public, and as far as this was concerned, he was doing a pretty good job. We were soon required to film ourselves leaving the building and arriving home. The cameras were replaced with newer, higher quality ones, and the animatronic now had a camera inside its booth. It appeared that the manager was becoming increasingly paranoid, warning us not to tell anyone, and became a recluse in his office, leaving only upon closing time. Supposedly, he had even received a letter from the owner about this issue. It wasn't until I saw yesterday's security footage from inside the animatronic's booth that I began to sympathize with my manager. It starts fine, with nothing out of the ordinary. But it quickly takes a turn for the worst. The feed becomes choppy and staticky, but through this you can see the animatronic jitter, raise its head, and look around. You can hear the whine of its motors. For some reason, this specific camera had a mic. And you can hear it proceed to crawl through an opening in the backside of the booth, and then the feed goes black. After a few minutes of nothingness, the feed comes back. I was practically flung out of my chair from shock by what my eyes beheld. The animatronic, dressed in its creepy clown outfit, parts torn and faded. I beckoned the other employees to come and watch, and shared my reaction. They confronted the manager, each with our barrages of questions raining down at him at once. He just sat in his chair, frowning, face as pale as a sheet of paper, doing his best to answer our questions. He eventually just turned around in his chair and made whining noises that we assumed to be crying. We left and continued our jobs. Later that day, he stumbled out of his office and started handing out pink slips to all the employees and giving them hugs. When he came to me, I told him that whenever he needed help, I'd be there. He thanked me, but instead of proceeding to hand me a slip, he just went back into his office. Later that night, as I was leaving, one of the employees shoved me up against the wall of the building and was about to beat me up for losing his job. His reasoning was that, except for my manager, I had the only key to the back room where the animatronic's costume was stored. Just as he landed a punch, the manager stormed out, walking towards the disgruntled former employee, who quickly became spooked and ran off. We parted ways without a word. At this point, I felt genuinely horrified. These insane events were ripping my kind-hearted manager as well as my co-workers to shreds, so I decided to do the right thing. The right thing being? Ask him to take it off his hands. He, of course, agreed, and I brought it home with me for the night. This morning, I brought it to a couple of paranormal investigator geeks who happen to be my friends from high school. They spewed a bunch of mumbo-jumbo and basically told me it wasn't haunted, but it did have some funky wiring issues. I took the thing to an electrician, and when he looked at it, he stared at me with this wide-eyed expression. "What?" I replied, weirded out by his gaze. This is... I can't... This is absolutely unbelievable. Come here." He beckoned me to come to his side, so I did. "What is it?" He pointed at an admittedly strange-looking circuit, with wires half exposed and chewed. "Look at this," he said. "Do you see that?" I said no, and he explained. "You see, this wire here, the red one," he pointed to a chewed-up red wire, "is creating what's known as an infinite circuit." I won't explain in detail, but he basically told me that a chewed-up wire that's touching a metal frame piece created, as I mentioned, an infinite circuit. It was somehow using the most minuscule amount of electricity to build up a charge and power a module that, in turn, powered the animatronic, which is why it took so long between complex actions. Which meant, somehow, that this thing still had a power source. I thanked him and brought it home again. Throwing it into a fire pit in my backyard, I grabbed a sturdy tree branch and beat the shit out of that thing, taking note not to use something metal like an axe for obvious reasons. After I was satisfied with taking my anger out on the thing, I showered it in all the lighter fluid I owned, and as cliche as it sounds, I lit it up and walked away. Then I ran back to it with a fire extinguisher and sprayed it. Okay, so maybe I beat it a little more with the empty fire extinguisher. Or a lot more. A whole lot more. The point is, it's gone. It's gone forever. I got my co-workers' jobs back and told them what happened, and my manager promoted me to his position just before he quit. Before the manager had given me the animatronic, he had stripped it of its costume again. Every day I come into work, I'll imagine its faded, ripped rubber mask sitting in the back room, grinning and waiting. But for what? I don't know. Anyway, thanks for listening.